Welcome. I'm Diego Rojas, and I'm your host for Hardcore Combat History. This project has been in development for more than 2 years, and due to personal and related issues regarding life, I would like to give a formal apology to my followers for taking so long. But I do want to take this time as well to express thanks and gratitude for your patience and your support throughout this time. It's really helped me not just only for the development of this episode as a whole, but if anything, just my life itself. So for that, I am eternally grateful to you, my small audience. I'll never forget you guys. And now a brief list of individuals that I really need to give a shout out to simply because they greatly assisted and or if anything the reason why these episodes are being a thing. Their knowledge really helped me out a lot. So here we go. Alice Brahm and Red Ivan Military for your information regarding Russian equipment, weapons, and uniforms. Chechen Alligator for your knowledge regarding Chechen culture, history, stories, and photographs from the First and the Second Chechen War. Smooth E. Diaz for your feedback, input, and knowledge on the use of armor, heavy weaponry, and most of all, urban warfare. Thank you, Devil Dog. Semper Fi. J. Cade for Chechen music, books, sources, feedback, and support with the first pilot episode. Your input really helped change the dynamic and, if anything, how I'm going to be moving forward with my episodes. So thank you, Jay. I really appreciate it. And last but not least, Ruski-Operator. Your music video edit titled Welcome to Hell Grozny had a profound impact on me on a very personal level. As 2 years ago, I was going through a very difficult time and event, and my mental headspace was not in the best place it should have been. And when I watched her edit, something snapped in me, not in a bad way, but in a very passionate way that I immersed myself into this conflict for the past 2 years. This being the First Chechen War, alongside a bit of the Second Chechen War as well. But without you, without your edit, this channel would not exist. And if anything, I think I would have been, even if I would have overcome what I went through later, it was your edit that pretty much pulled me out and made me focus on something productive. And because of that, I am eternally grateful to you. And to my audience, please look for the link in the description below that will have his video and please check it out. His content's amazing, and for the most part, again, Ruski, thank you. And now, since I do have to give out a dire warning, the following episode will contain descriptions, images, and videos that are both graphic and violent in nature and may be disturbing for young viewers and listeners. You have been warned. And other than that, and with that out of the way, please enjoy the very first episode of Hardcore Combat History, Prelude to Annihilation, Grozny, 94. Prelude, noun, an action or event serving as an introduction to something more important. Annihilation, noun, complete destruction or obliteration. I want you to think about these two words and honestly reflect on what battle or what war comes to mind. Maybe it's the Battle of Stalingrad, where the German Sixth Army pretty much nearly gets wiped out. Or maybe it's the First French Indochina War. The French legionaries and the French paratroopers come face to face with the Viet Minh. Or maybe it's Cannae, where the Roman legionaries get wiped out by Hannibal's Carthaginian warriors. Whatever the case may be, if you want a genuine story of horror, of when an apparent modern army decides to go to war against an inferior nation, you came to the right place. Because it's these two words that would end up sealing the fate of thousands in what would be known as the First Chechen War. And so our story begins like countless others, and that's geography. Now, if you ever attended a history class, whether it's in junior high, high school, or university, for the most part, at least one point in your life you should have attended one, you'll realize that there's one factor that pretty much ties all groups of people together, or cultures or civilizations, and that's geography. Because geography is what forms the identity and the mindset of a group of people, because they live there, because it's what they call home. Whether it's the Mongols and the Asian steppe or the hoplites of Sparta and Greece, your environment plays a pivotal role in not just your warrior culture, but the way you wage war itself. and nobody knows this better than the Chechens of Chechnya. Located in the North Caucasus region of Russia, it covers approximately 6,680 square miles, making it roughly smaller than the state of New Jersey. However, it forms a natural barrier in passage into Eastern Europe and Western Asia. And along the northern region of Chechnya, it's composed of plains and lowlands, with the Terek River running through it, while it also includes a semi-desert Nogay steppe that's filled with sagebrush and sand dunes. As for the western part of Chechnya, plains and foothills dominate, largely dotted with sparse forest and woodland, while the south, dominated by the northern slopes of the Caucasus mountain range, form the Chechen highlands, filled with deep gorges and narrow valleys, filled with dense forests and woodlands, formed by the Argun River. And to the east, the foothills of the greater Caucasus Mountains create a mixed mass of hilly and highland areas dotted with forests at higher elevations, alongside ridges, valleys, and plains cut northward again by the Argun River. And finally, the center of Chechnya with its capital Grozny, surrounded by a blend of rolling hills, valleys, and plains dotted with the steppe and woodlands, alongside the Terek and Sunza River running through it. It is this environment and terrain that the Chechens would call home. As for the Chechen people themselves, their roots can be traced as far back as circa 10,000 to 8,000 BC, in which their migration from the Fertile Crescent would eventually lead to their final settlement in the highlands of the northern Caucasus, forming what would be known as the Nakh people. Now, the Nakh people are interesting as they were composed of other groups of people in the North Caucasus, such as the Bats and the Ingush, who used the Nakh language along other cultural similarities to form the backbones of their society. And the result of this adoption is a highly intricate and complex clan system known as the Tiep. And within this clan system, there existed a concept called a Dat, which encompassed the customs, morals, and laws that governed their society. Now, this society as a whole was predominantly male dominated and led by elders, which emphasized discipline, fearlessness toward your enemies, honor for your family, and most of all, your Tiep. And above anything else, the preservation of freedom and independence, no matter the cost. And according to legend and tradition, as the Chechen saying goes, we are free and equal like wolves. It is this quote that the Nakh, whose descendants would later on be the Dzooks, followed by the Chechens themselves, would endure countless centuries of warfare fighting against enemies such as the Cimmerians and Scythians, and even earning the distinction of being able to not only successfully resist, but also defend against the Mongols not just once, but twice. And eventually, they would hold off against their most hated and notorious enemy for the next 2 centuries, before being occupied for the next 130 years, that being Russia. If these centuries of resistance were not warning enough for the foreshadowing of what lay ahead for Russia, what followed in 1991 would be the catalyst toward the First Chechen War. 1991 was one of the most important years in world history, largely due to the Cold War, which had started in 1947 between the United States and the Soviet Union, coming to an end, as communism had begun to fall apart all throughout Eastern Europe. Amidst the chaos, many former occupied states by the Soviets, such as Poland and Ukraine, were already in the process of seeking their sovereignty and independence again. It was during 1991 that Chechnya, after having endured roughly 130 years of occupation, subjugation, and near extermination via genocide, would turn toward one man to guide them into restoring their long-awaited dream of sovereignty and independence. His name was Dozakar Dudayev, a 47-year-old former Soviet Air Force general turned Chechen politician. Dudayev was born on February 15, 1944, and was merely a toddler when his family were forcefully deported in what was known at the time as Operation Lentil. Approved by Joseph Stalin and enforced by NKVD chief Lavrentiy Beria to break apart any unity and attempts of rebellion among the Chechen and Ingush population, it began on February 23, 1944, in the midst of the Second World War, alongside the same day for the Red Army Day in the Soviet Union, which commemorated those who served or were serving in the Soviet armed forces. NKVD troops were sent out and systematically went from house to house to round up any individuals or families merely giving them 15 to 30 minutes to pack all their belongings in one bag or one suitcase and leave their homes. They were then moved and imprisoned in Studebaker US 6 trucks and transferred and packed into unheated and uninsulated freight cars. If the conditions of the transport weren't brutal enough, the fate of those who resisted was death, as one example being the Kaibak massacre, in which around 700 Chechen civilians, largely composed of elderly, pregnant women, and children, burned alive. Others were shot, as noted by one eyewitness recalling the actions of the NKVD forces when they came to her village. They combed the huts to make sure there was no one left behind. The soldier who came into the house did not want to bend down. He raked the hut with a burst from his submachine gun. Blood trickled out from under the bench where a child was hiding. The mother screamed and hurled herself at the soldier. He shot her too. There was not enough rolling stock. Those left behind were shot. Their bodies were covered with earth and sand carelessly. The shooting had also been careless, and people started wiggling out of the sand like worms. The NKVD men spent the whole night shooting them all over again. Those survivors who were on the freight car trains, however, endured a journey of hell that spanned over 2,000 miles, with many succumbing to hunger, diseases such as typhus, alongside exposure in which they were dropped off in desolate regions where temperatures could drop as far as below as negative 58 degrees Fahrenheit during the winter and soaring to 122 degrees Fahrenheit during the summer. It was this hellish journey in conditions that Dolzakar Dudayev had to endure, and would survive alongside his family, in which the 13 years of his life were spent in the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, also known as modern-day Kazakhstan. It wasn't until 1957, under the leadership and policies of Nikita Khrushchev, that he began to undo the damage by Joseph Stalin via de-Stalinization. It was around that point that Dudayev and his family would return to their native homeland of Chechnya. It was his return to Chechnya where he would study to become an electrician, and in 1962 became enrolled in the Tambov Higher Military Aviation School for Pilots, of which he graduated in 1966, officially making him part of the Soviet Air Force. In the years that followed, he would join the ranks of the Soviet Communist Party in 1968, furthering his education at the prestigious University of the Gargan Air Force Academy and marrying Alaventina Kolikova, a Russian poet and the daughter of a Soviet officer with whom he had 3 children with. With his enlistment in the Soviet Air Force going as far back as 1962, Dudayev would rise to the rank of Major General, becoming Russia's first Chechen general. His service largely consisted and was composed of working in a strategic bombing unit of the Soviet Air Force in both Siberia and Ukraine. He would eventually be awarded the Order of the Red Star and the Order of the Red Banner for his alleged service during the Soviet-Afghan War, of which there is still vast speculation to this day and something that he himself denied later on. His first command, however, was assuming command of the 326 Heavy Bomber Aviation Division in Estonia, of which many of those who served under him regarded Dudayev as a person who was both resourceful, charismatic, and most of all, ambitious. Even in the midst of his military service for the Soviet Union, Dudayev strongly supported Chechen nationalism, something that was seen in 1990 during his service in Estonia, of which he not only learned the language, but overall showed tolerance toward the Estonian restoration of independence, alongside refusing orders of shutting down the Estonian television and parliament. Afterwards, his division was withdrawn from Estonia, and Dudayev would officially submit his resignation from the Soviet military. In May 1990, Dudayev returned to Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, and proceeded to devote himself entirely to local politics. The result was his election for the executive committee of the unofficial opposition group known as the All-National Congress of the Chechen People, also known as the NCCHP, which advocated for the sovereignty of Chechnya as a separate republic of the Soviet Union. However, in the 3 months that followed, the first of many events would transpire that would forever change his life, as well as of Chechnya forever. August 31st, 1991, Doku Zavgayev, the communist leader of the Chechen English ASSR, did not condemn the August 1991 coup d'etat against Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. Following its failure, the disintegration of the Soviet Union began to rapidly transpire. Dudayev and his followers, largely composed of former and current military personnel, began to organize and plan their own coup. On September 6, 1991, Militants of the NCCHP stormed the session of the local Supreme Soviet Parliament, killing the head of Grozny's branch of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Vitaly Kotusenko, who was presumed to have been thrown out of a window or fell to his death, while other parliament members were wounded. Through these means, the government of the Chechen English ASSR was effectively dissolved, and the capture of the Grozny television station alongside the government buildings allowed Dudayev to announce that the Chechen Revolution had occurred and that the Revolution Committee would assume all power before the snap presidential elections. And so, after a referendum on October 1st, 1991, Dudayev would confirm his new position as president of the newly established Chechen Republic of Ichkeria. Yet there was a man who would stand in his way in the years to come. His name was Boris Yeltsin, first elected president of the recently established Russian Federation. Boris Yeltsin was born on February 1st, 1931 in the Ural Oblast, in the midst of what was known at the time as the Soviet famine of 1930 to 1933. He would not only endure hunger, but an abusive father who would forever change his life. Yet, in the midst of all this hardship, he was academically bright, managing to become a student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk in September of 1949. During this time, he would also meet his future wife, Nayana Ilosvona Girana, a fellow student. However, he dropped out temporarily from the university in 1952, largely due to contracting tonsillitis and rheumatic fever. It was during this period, from the summer of 1953, that he would spend traveling across all over the Soviet Union. It wasn't until in June of 1955 that he would complete his studies, managing to achieve work at the Lower ISEC Construction Directorate in Sverdlovsk. Yeltsin would develop a reputation as not only as a devoted worker, but also punctual, ensuring him moving up the ranks of the organization and even going as far as achieving the rank of head engineer at the Construction Directorate number 13. In March of 1960, Boris Yeltsin would become a probationary member of the governing Communist Party and would not become a full-fledged member until March of 1961. Through his previous reputation within the construction industry as not only as a hard worker, but due to his punctuality and effectiveness, would earn him the position of first secretary of Sverdlovsk Oblast by Moscow itself. As the year 1985 came along, Yeltsin would again rise among the party ranks, earning himself the position of the first secretary of the Moscow Gorkom of the CPSU, or in other words, the mayor of Moscow. Yet he was discontent with how Gorbachev was running things and would attempt to resign in 1987, something that was completely unheard of in the history of the Soviet Union. Although he was told to reconsider, he was considered politically immature and reckless, resulting in an attempted suicide attempt on November 9, 1987, having cut his chest with multiple cuts to bleed out, which failed. After his recovery, he was subjected to a Moscow General Assembly, of which he was not only fired, but humiliated and also demoted, something that he never forgot nor forgave. Due to his actions, alongside his criticism of Gorbachev's government, Yeltsin would earn the reputation as not only as a rebel among the Russian people, but overall grow to become an anti-establishment figure. It wasn't until May 29, 1990, that Yeltsin would be elected to the position of elected chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, with Gorbachev personally pleading with the Russian deputies not to select Yeltsin. This resulted in a power struggle, of which Yeltsin would resign on July 12, 1990. It wouldn't be until a year later that on July 10, 1991, that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Boris Yeltsin began his inauguration as first president of the newly established Russian Federation. Although, at the time, he had largely approved the independence of former bloc states, such as Ukraine, the claims by Dudayev for Chechen independence were not taken lightly. By November 7, 1991, just a mere month after Dudayev took office, Yeltsin signed Decree number 178, which declared a state of emergency for the former Chechen English Republic. The message was clear. Chechnya would not leave the Russian Federation, and if it continued to persist, would be taken back via military force. A day later, on November 8, 1991, the separate Operational Purpose Division, also known as Omsdon, was a rapid deployment internal security division of the internal troops of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Only 300 men were sent towards Grozny via an Il-18 transport aircraft, even though many commanders at the time recommended over 1,200. The 300-man task force was roughly composed of a Special Forces training detachment, elements of the 2nd Motor Rifle Regiment, and a special motorized unit of militia known as the SPCHM. Prior to the deployment of the 300-man task unit, over 495 men of the Ministry Interior, who were already stationed in Grozny, began to face an unprecedented amount of hostility from the local Chechen population. As the IL-18 aircraft made its way from Moscow Airport directly toward the Grozny Airport, it would be a flight that would roughly span about 3 hours and 30 minutes. Yet when the 300-unit task force arrived at Grozny Airport, they were confronted by the crowd, which had significantly grown to 10,000 Chechens, of which 500 were armed. The reinforcements at the time that were at the nearby KGB garrisons and MBD building, MBD is the short abbreviation regarding the Ministry of Interior, had previously been stormed, with many of the Russian personnel being taken prisoner, alongside a significant amount of weapons also being obtained, effectively making them hostages, and making the situation dire for a violent confrontation. Yet the Russian senior officer at Grozny Airport at the time, Colonel Oleg Ovnechennikov, managed to smooth the situation over by meeting and talking directly to Dudayev himself, telling him that there was no state of emergency and for his soldiers to immediately surrender their weapons over to the Chechens. Although this saved lives, the government in Moscow became frenzied in a state of negotiation and through a vote declared that Yeltsin's decree number 178 had no legal basis for Russian troops to be in Grozny, effectively putting them at risk at becoming hostages. Yet Dudayev, through a gesture of goodwill on November 11th of 1991, permitted the Almsdon task unit alongside all MBD troops stationed in Grozny to leave with their weapons. With the failure at Grozny Airport, this was only the beginning of many humiliating incidents that would cripple the Russian Federation's grasp and influence on the region of Chechnya. On November 23, 1991, Dudayev declared Decree No. 9, which welcomed the cancellation of the Russian state of emergency, while also condemning the aggressive actions of the Russian Federation. This, resulting in the complete sealing of Chechnya, putting the movement of all and any military equipment under his complete control. 3 days after the decree, on November 26, Dudayev would call upon General Pert Sokolov, military commandant of Grozny, Captain First Rank Ibrahim Diniev, and head of the HQ of Civil Defense, Colonel Vaganov, into his office. It was here that he made it clear that all military assets belonged to Chechnya, and any attempts by any Russian personnel to escape via the border would be arrested. The following day, in an interview made to the Russian newspaper Red Star, Dudayev confirmed his intentions that the Chechens were more than ready to fight a war against Russia. On November 30th, the Russian Federation sent First Deputy Commander of the Commonwealth of the Independent States, Pavel Grachev, alongside General Anatoly Chernisov, head of the HQ of North Caucasian Military District. The meeting went far from smooth, as when Grachev requested the removal of heavy weapons out of Chechnya, was instantly cut off by Dudayev, who yelled and reiterated that all weapons belonged to the Chechen Republic. After the meeting had concluded, Chernyov recommended a Russian armored assault into Grozny as soon as possible, even going as far as ordering General Pert Sokolov to have the 392nd Tank Training Regiment, based in Shali, only 21 miles away, to be ready. Although Grachev agreed with the plan at the time, and also knowing that the Chechens had no anti-tank weapons at their current disposal, he would eventually reject the offer, instead choosing the alternative, which was by using force to take the 173rd center depots and heavy weapons out of Chechnya via convoys. These 3 convoys would be made up of Kamaz trucks and buses that would be loaded with families of servicemen, while the escorts, composed of tank battalions, would head toward the nearby Russian bases in Kizlyar, Narzan, and Mozdok. At the same time, OMON units, who were Special Purpose Mobile Unit or Secret Police, and internal troops, which were paramilitary military police of the Ministry of Internal Affairs or MBD, would ensure protection of the convoys from locals and clear the roads. Although the plan was sent by Grachev to Moscow, there was no response back. Nonetheless, decisive action by Russian commanders of the North Caucasus Military District, led by General Lev Shustosko, began work in early December of 1991. Their first mission in the first week of December was conducted by General Chenerozov of which was the complete removal of all ciphering equipment by secretly flying it out back and forth via negotiations. The second week was the dismantling and sabotage of all targeting equipment, which included the following: missiles, artillery, tanks, and other types of weapon systems. Meanwhile, all specific equipment such as night vision, radio stations, and engineering equipment were taken from depots and transferred out of Chechnya or sabotaged. Although it should have been obvious for the Chechens in seeing Russian commanders moving back and forth on transport planes, it did not attract the attention due to families leaving Chechnya on those said same planes. By early January of 1992, all weapon systems were voided, including the fuse of bombs and anti-tank mines being replaced with dummies. Arsenals also underwent mudding conducted by engineers with combat experience. And although the vast amount of work was not authorized and never reported, it did essentially mean that every single piece of heavy weaponry taken by the Russians in 1994 to 1995 had either no working targeting device or nothing at all. With the removal of the majority of equipment on January 4, 1992, General HQ issued Directive Number 314/3/0159, officially disbanding the 173rd Training Center. Meanwhile, General Shostosko would write off the following equipment and vehicles, which were as followed: 18 BM-21 Grads, which were 122mm rocket launcher trucks, 4 9K-52 Lunas, artillery rocket trucks, 3 9P-148s, anti-tank destroyer armored cars, 7 BM-37s, 82mm mortars, 60-62 tanks, 35 BMPs 1s and 2s, which were infantry fighting vehicles, 14 BTR-70s, which were armored personnel carriers, 16 BRDM, which were amphibious armored scout cars, and 4 BTS, armored recovery vehicles or tractors. Yet even among the dismantling and decommissioning of both the base and its equipment, what would occur throughout the following weeks would take the Russians completely by surprise. The first recorded attacks upon a Russian garrison occurred on the night of January 4th and 5th of 1992, as several Chechen militants seized access control entrance of the signaling battalion of the 339 Radio Tactical Regiment of Air Defense in Kankala. When the Chechens demanded that the officer in duty, Major Vladimir Chechen, to give them access to the weapons room, he promptly refused and was shot dead after trying to hit the alarm. Attacks continued upon Russian servicemen and their families in the days that followed. This resulted in the commander of the 173rd Center, General Sokolov, in ordering the distribution of weapons among officers and further reinforcement of security on bases, which paused the attacks, but only for a while, only for them to continue even after these measures were implemented, as noted in the following dates. February 1st, communication point of the Caspian Flotilla was destroyed. Over 100 arms were seized. February 4th, attack on the 566th Regiment of the MVD. 3,000 pieces of weapons were obtained alongside 184,000 rounds of ammunition. February 7th, attack on the 93 RF Radiotechnical Regiment in Grozny. Over 150 pieces of weapons were obtained. February 7th, 15 military compound was attacked, but the assault was repelled. February 7th as well, attack on the 382nd Training Aviation Regiment. Over 400 pieces of weapons were obtained. February 8th, attacks on the 1st and 15th military compound in Grozny. Several armored units were taken. February 19th, depots of the Grozny Garrison Hospital were annexed by the Chechens. Throughout March, the robbery of Russian military units continued, and although Russia had managed to transfer a large portion of vehicles and weapons out of Chechnya through the withdrawal, Dudayev became enraged, and on April 1st, 1992, threatened to execute any Russian servicemen and members of their families if they dared to cross the border without permission, resulting in a standstill of the operation. For a month, Russian General Boris Grozny would report to Moscow that there was simply no peaceful way of getting all weapons out of Chechnya. Although letters were sent to President Yeltsin and the Ministry of Defense, there was merely silence. As April rolled around to May of 1992, roughly 70 to 80% of the weapons and vehicles inventory had been taken back to Russia. Yet it was clear by Dudayev and the Chechens that no Russian service member and their families would be allowed to leave until an agreement was made. And so, on May 28, Pavel Grachev issued a directive to the commander of the North Caucasian Military District, Lev Shatosko. Decree number 316/1/0308SH, which transferred 50% of heavy weapons to the Chechen Republic. In return, Dudayev agreed to let all Russian servicemen and their families leave Chechnya. With that, the Russians left behind what can only be described as a minor arsenal of weapons and vehicles, which were the following: 42 tanks, composed of T-72A and B and T-62M variants, 110 APCs, BMP, BTRs, MTOBs, and BDRMs, over 150 artillery systems, two S-3s, which were 152mm tracked self-propelled howitzers, D-30s, which were 122mm howitzers, MT-12s, which were 100mm anti-tank guns, BM-21s, which were 122mm rocket launcher trucks, BM-37s, which were 82mm mortars, alongside mortars of various other calibers. Over 100 ATGMs, also known as anti-tank guidance missile systems, composed of Faggots, Metis, and Konkurs. 500 RPG launchers, over 1,000 heavy machine guns, 27 AA pieces, which were composed of ZU-23-4s, which were tracked anti-air vehicles with 4x23mm 2A7 autocannons, ZU-23-2s, which were towed stationary 23mm twin autocannons for anti-aircraft defense, and S-60s, which were 57mm towed and stationary anti-air cannons. And finally, the over 57,000 firearms that were also given to the Chechens, which included the AK and AKS-74, the AKM and AKM-S, the RPK and PKM machine gun, the SBD sniper rifle, the AGS-17 Plamya grenade launcher, and finally the Kord's 6P-57 heavy machine gun, alongside other heavy machine guns of various calibers. As a result of this instant acquisition of inventory regarding weapons and vehicles, Dudayev turned to three men in order to organize and structure the Chechen armed forces. The first man was Aslan Maskhadov, born 1951, died 2005. He would become the chief of staff of the armed forces of the Chechen Republic as he was appointed by Dudayev himself. He was recognized as a calm and measured leader, and he would gain experience in defensive and offensive operations as the years went by. He overall proved to be decisive and a patient organizer, among being an inspiration to his men. Then there was Ruslav Germanovich Galayev, born 1964 and died in 2004, a former Spetsnaz operator in Soviet-Afghan War. His aggressive mindset, alongside largely leading by example by fighting alongside his men, made him a unique individual among the ranks. He would overall create the Chechen Special Forces unit known as Boars, which means wolf, and as the months and the years would go by, would earn the nickname of the Black Angel. And finally, Shamil Basayev, born 1965, died 2006. He was a former Soviet military firefighter before he became a Chechen militia leader. Ruthless and aggressive, he actively fought alongside his men, yet he was quiet and an intellectual. He would become controversial due to his methods of using Russian civilians as human shields or hostages later on. As a result of these three men, this was the following command structure: General HQ, led by Aslan Makhadov, the HQ Battalion, the National Guard, the Special Forces of National Guard, the President's Guard, the Security Service, the Special Forces of President's Guard, the Special Forces Regiment Boers, Separate Battalion of Special Operations, Reconnaissance Divisionary Battalion, Shalit Tank Regiment and Anti-Tank Battalion, Department of State Security, Battalion of Basangira Banavoski, Shatoy Battalion, Border Guard Brigade, Border Guard Special Forces, Diversioning Reconnaissance Mountain Regiment, Narus Battalion, Shali Battalion, Warriors of the Islam Battalion, Gudimans Battalion, Grozny Chu Territorial Defense Detachment, Islamic Battalion Jamaat, Afghan Battalion, Arab Volunteers, Yuna Unsel Ukrainian Volunteers, Maadtavinsk Battalion Akamzat Khanarov, Galavonchevosoy Regiment, Special Forces Regiment of the President, Brigade of Internal Troops of Ministry Interior, and finally the Amon of Ministry of Interior. Most units, however, especially among the locals, tended to be largely militia composed of 200 to 250 men, with the National Guard being the exception with a detachment of over 2,000 men spread all over Chechnya. In total, the Chechen armed forces were largely composed of 15,000 men, who largely wore civilian clothing alongside ex-Soviet military apparel, which would play a key role in unfolding during the early skirmishes that would occur in the coming months and years. However, the Republic would face the first of its many issues as the conflict of Ossetian Ingush in October through November of 1992 made its neighbor to the west, Ingushetia, opting to join the Russian Federation rather than remaining independent. Yet the mismanagement of political power, alongside the issues of running a newly established nation, would rear its ugly head in 1993. 1993 brought upon a fervor of Chechen nationalism throughout the Republic, with the Russian alphabet discontinued in schools and the printing of currency alongside the decree that every man had the right to bear arms. Yet it wasn't without consequence, as ethnic Russians, Ukrainians, and even Armenians were violently targeted and forced to leave. The attempts of the Chechen parliament for a referendum on the loss of public confidence in Dudayev was met with retaliation by Dudayev himself, who would completely dissolve it, shutting down any aspect of opposition that threatened the already unsteady region of Chechnya, which was being plagued with economic inflation, crime, and the growing of opposition forces that would plunge the nation into a brief and savage civil war. It was here that in 1994 Russia would use any means necessary to ensure that Dudayev's government would fail, and began to conduct covert operations by reaching out to Chechen leaders who opposed Dudayev. And so, with the blessing of Boris Yeltsin and the appointing of Deputy of Nationalities Affairs Minister Alexander Koltonokov, a former Armor Corps officer, he began to curate anti-Dudayev Chechen forces. Throughout the summer of 1994, pro-Russian Chechen militants would be trained by both the 33rd Motor Rifle Regiment alongside the 20th Motor Rifle Division near Volgograd. They were led by Umar Avaturkanov, a former NVD Soviet officer who would receive 10 T-62 tanks, 26 BTR-60s, 4 R-145BMs, 46 Gaz-66 trucks, and several Kamaz trucks with weapons, composed of small arms alongside the ammo that was required, would be delivered straight to the village of Zanamosko near the near end of August to early September. During this time, several unidentified Su-25 Frogfoot and Mi-24s began to hammer several of Dudayev's forces in the Argun. Although the air power and air support was quite significant, Dudayev's forces managed to prevail and capture the Argun, inflicting one of the first, if not early, losses toward this operation for the coup attempt. Yet even in the midst of this chaos, the operation was slow, as on October 13, 1994, Umar proceeded with the decision to move his headquarters to Tstoy Yort, which was 73 miles away in the southeast, yet would be roughly 9 miles away from the Chechen capital of Grozny. Meanwhile, the government in Moscow pushed for a forced solution, while Boris Yeltsin's envoy, Ruslan Kazbolotov, attempted a peaceful resolution, with the proposal being made for a meeting of 10 to 15 people. However, nothing came of it. Umar, on the other hand, advocated for the use of military force rather than diplomacy, and thus the first coup operation proceeded forward. On the morning of October 15, 1994, the opposition forces split into two groups, one led by Umar Avnotakanov and the other by Beslan Gantamirov, the former mayor of Grozny and an ally turned enemy of Dudayev, in an attempt to assault and capture Grozny. The main convoy was composed of one T-62 tank, a dozen BTRs, Gaz-66 trucks, and a long line of private vehicles packed with opposition forces. At around 3 p.m., two unidentified Mi-24 gunships began their gun runs on military targets, while the convoy, led by Umar Avatokanov, entered Grozny via Tutakachevsky Street, through the food market, and proceeded towards the president's palace. On the other side of the Sunza River, detachments of Beslan took over the 15th Military Compartment in the south side and stopped to wait. At the crossing of Tukavesky Street and Sultan Dudayev Boulevard, Shamil Bazayev's Reconnaissance Diversionary Battalion sprung an ambush on the T-62 tank and BTRs with accurate RPG fire, turning them into burning heaps of metal as the survivors stumbled out, only to be gunned down by small arms fire. Avtorkanov panicked and the whole convoy opened fire in all directions, resulting in being pinned down on a mere street. Meanwhile, Ruslan Labanov ordered his men to take positions in the buildings of the fire department of the Ministry of Interior, also around Tutakovsky Street, becoming occupied in his own firefight against Udayev's forces. In the hours that followed as the fighting raged, many opposition members left the city, having lost confidence in their leadership. By 3 a.m. on October the 16th, the Russian-backed Chechen forces left the city entirely. Although casualties were on paper low, there is still speculation to this day due to the opposition forces themselves and the Russian government not wanting to admit any humiliating statistics. What is known, however, is that the opposition forces lost a tank, 5 BTRs, and had several wounded, captured, and a number of killed in action. The Chechen casualties are unknown, yet speculation assumes that they were low due to the use of high ground and cover, and with Shamil Bisayev receiving a bullet wound through his shoulder. With this regard, the first coup attempt was a humiliating failure, with Ruslan Kabaslov blaming opposition leaders of cowardice and being traitors, while Ruslan Labanov, a Chechen warlord who participated in the failed defense of the Argun, alongside this operation, openly accused Russian leadership of supplying old weapons. After October 15, the Russian Federal Security Service, or FSB head, Evgeny Zaboyastanov, who was directly appointed by Yeltsin, conducted a meeting to discuss the reasons of failure alongside possible solutions. Umar Avtanakanov and Beslan Gatamirov, alongside support by envoy Ruslan Kapasnadatov, asked to be provided with heavier weapons, tanks, and professional crews made up of Russian crewmen and training. And so, in the weeks that followed through the slow cog of bureaucracy, on November the 1st, Russian HQ issued Secret Directive Order number 312/1/0130SH, which gave orders for the North Caucasus Military District to provide 40 to 50 T-72 tanks. These armored units were given by the 131st Separate Mortar Rifle Brigade, Malkov, and the 33rd Mortar Rifle Regiment in Volgograd, of which only 36 tanks were procured. 2 days later, on November the 3rd, the Military Counterintelligence Department of the FSB, commanded by General Alexei Moloyakov, began the hiring process for the tank crews under the direct orders of Gavo Prachev, who had managed to obtain the position of Minister of Defense by Boris Yeltsin back in 1992 due to being a close friend of his. This was further approved by Moscow Military District CO, Leonty Kozhnostov, of which another Russian general named Karpov worked directly with the counterintelligence officers in order to find good recruits from respective units. In total, 82 servicemen were hired ranging from ranks of lieutenant to major, and several NCOs from the following units. The 4th Guards Gantamarov Tank Division, which provided 53 men. The 2nd Guards Taman Mortar Rifle Division, which provided 3 men. The 18th Separate Mortar Rifle Brigade, which provided 13 men. And finally, the Vistaril Higher Officers Classes, which also provided 13 men. Through this manpower, now began the overall allocation of funding for this operation regarding the second coup attempt, which easily came from Moscow and was listed in the following order. The transportation of the tanks, which was 4 million rubles or 1,300 United States dollars. Participation in combat, which was 5 million rubles, $1,620. The receiving of a light wound, 25 million rubles, which was $16,207. The receiving of a heavy wound, which was 75 million rubles, which was $24,311. And finally, in the event of being KIA, 150 million rubles, which added up to $48,622 for the soldier's respective family. In a morbid sense, the Russian servicemen who would participate in this operation were at least promised their needs would be taken care of, alongside their families. Yet when all hired servicemen were flown from Chakabosko Air Base to Mozdok, they were debriefed that they would receive support by 3 Mi-24 gunships and 40 ex-Special Forces members tasked with the conducting and direct combat operations vital for the success of the operation. Yet problems arose in Mozdok as the FSB recruiters were not liked by the commander of the 4th Kantamurov Division, General Boris Poloyakov, who, after learning several of his men had been hired, attempted to interfere by banning their participation in the operation as a whole. His envoy, Colonel Orlov, even came head-to-head with the Deputy of Nationalities Affairs Minister Alexander Koltenokov at the Chartzabalsky Air Base, resulting in the success of his servicemen being returned to their divisions. Yet even with these attempts, on November the 10th, Moscow gave the order and the approval for moving of Russian troops into Grozny alongside their anti-Dudayev Chechen allies. With the operation full swing, November 15th would have General Boris Polyov receiving a phone call from the head of General HQ, Mikhail Kolonuskov, who in a rude fashion gave orders for his men to be sent to Mozdok, undoing his previous achievement of preventing his men from participating in the operation. The following day, all newly hired troops arrived at Mozdok, gathering at the 68th Arsenal base of the main Rocket and Artillery Directorate, with the first arrival of the T-72A tanks arriving. Ironically, none of the Russian tankmen were familiar with the T-72, as all of them had been trained on the T-80. As a result, the Russians began to train their Chechen allies, of which many had no prior experience with armor and barely had time to practice, resulting in the decision to have 16 full Russian crew-operated tanks, while the remainder would be mixed. On November 17, 12 tanks and 2 trucks loaded with weapons and ammo arrived from Mozdok to Snamovsky via ferry. Around the same time, head of General HQ Mikhail Goloneskov arrived in Mozdok alongside several Russian officers. General Hennady Zhukov, deputy commander of the 8th Army Corps, was appointed responsible for the Russian side of operations, yet sole control alongside decisions would rest entirely on Konoskakov. And so, the second coup operation began on November the 18th, among a salvo of artillery and air support beginning to hammer Dudayev's forces and positions in Bratsko village. Within a few mere hours, the village was secured with 3 opposition battalions led by Yahya Garakanov, Rizvan Tulayev, and Uzman Saturyev. In the 4 days that followed, the opposition forces dug in, reinforced the positions with more ammo and reinforcements, and began to further their plans. And so, on November 22nd, 1994, a fighting meeting, if not debrief, was held that included Russian government representatives and the Chechen coup leaders themselves regarding the operation. The plan was simple and the objective was clear. 18 assault groups composed of armor and infantry would enter Grozny from 4 directions. Artakanov from Precheriya in the north and northeastern part of Grozny, Gatamura from Uris-Mortin, the southwest of Grozny, and finally Laboznov from the Argun, southeast of Grozny. Another 18 groups will remain in reserve and join later on. The operation was supposed to begin at 4:30 in the morning and end by 6 in the morning, with an encirclement of the presidential palace. Meanwhile, the 40-man ex-Special Forces unit would be divided into 2 teams, of which they would proceed to attack the palace with RPO-A Schmelz, which is a rocket-propelled flamethrower that could fire a thermobaric incendiary round that upon detonation created an expanding cloud. Within this cloud's ignition, it could produce heat and overpressure, which was equivalent, if not comparable, to a 152mm artillery round, in order to create a fiery hellscape before the arrival of the tanks. In total, the opposition forces numbered roughly 5,000 men, of which their armored support was 35 T-72A tanks, of which 24 were manned by Russian crews, and the other 12 by Chechen crews. Only 1 would be held in reserve, while the rest entered Grozny. The other armored assets included 40 BTR-80s armed with 14.5mm KPV-2 machine guns, or 30mm 2A-72 cannons, alongside the coaxial 7.62mm PK-2 machine gun. And furthermore, supported by a couple of R-145BMs serving as command and communication vehicles. For the most part, command would fall upon an Mi-9 helicopter that would be occupied by General Koloskakov and his staff. But as we all know, in warfare, as pointed out by German Marshal Helmuth von Moltke, is that no plan survives first contact with the enemy, and thus Murphy's Law came into play, unleashing its mayhem upon this battlefield. For starters, the teams and crews had never trained together. Commanders didn't know each other. There was no common understanding of the plan. Communication was done with 80 R-105 AIM portable radio packs, which had already been phased out by the Soviet military as far back as the 1980s. Intelligence by the locals in Grozny was completely non-existent. And finally, when Colonel Akhmed's Kamalotov, a leader of the main force, was ignored by group commanders when he requested a reconnaissance of Grozny prior to its assault. And the only decent reconnaissance was conducted by the 2 Special Forces team, which would make it to the presidential palace and even manage to go as far as checking the routes and making notes of Dudayev's forces. What you had in the making is what in many of those in the military either call snafu, which means situational normal all fucked up, or in simple terms, a clusterfuck. And the reports that the Special Forces team brought back were alarming, as the whole plan was compromised due to the routes of advance being blocked by Dudayev's forces, who blocked positions with ambush teams lying in wait with RPGs and SMARMs, alongside possessing the high ground cover and knowledge of the city itself. And the Special Forces team would in vain suggest alternative routes, only to be overruled by higher ups in command. And so, the fate of the second coup was sealed. On the eve of operations, Russian crews were told not to show themselves out of their tanks and to use fake Chechen names. Their tanks were also painted with a white color applied to spots in order to differentiate friendly armor among the upcoming chaos. During the night of November 25th to 26th, 5 infantry opposition battalions concentrated in Tolstoy Yort, the small town which was only 13 miles away from Grozny to the north. At 3 a.m. on November the 26th, 1994, Pechetry commander Kalamanotov assembled his battalion and assault group commanders. Yet it was obvious, the fighters were not ready for action. As noted by him, the unresolved issues were those for which Artenokov was responsible. There was not enough transport for everyone. The batteries and the radios were flat, and there was no fuel in the tanks. This all became evident at the precise moment we were due to move off. The upshot was that while some had transport, others had to walk. While the tanks trundled from one filling station to another in search of diesel, there was virtually no communication with the commanders of the rest of the tank column. The following commanders of the battalions were now led by the following: Gurakanov, Satuyev, Tolanov, Kombatilov, Sadyov, and Labaznov. By the time the tanks arrived, they were extremely low on fuel, ensuring the loss of momentum in the following hours. Instead of heading toward Grozny around 4:30 in the morning, most of the battalions were trying to resolve the fueling issue for their tanks alongside gathering all infantry forces together in one spot. The Special Forces detachment, meanwhile, made their way to the palace around 5 a.m. and fired several RPO-A rounds, waiting for the armor support to show up at 6 in the morning. Yet there was no sign of the units themselves. By 9 in the morning, the first of the convoy had managed to enter Grozny and bypass the cannery plant. Yet, as the convoy and other units entered Grozny, it was clear that many would find their rendezvous with death. Dudayev's forces, using Dragunov sniper rifles, fired from the rooftops, resulting in the first death of the pro-Russian Chechen battalion commanders, that being Yaya Garakanov. Others would follow suit, with some killed and others badly wounded. Umar Utarakanov moved over from Mayokovsky Street towards the printing house and stopped his convoy to use the R-145BM, the Command and Communication BTR, to talk with Mozdok, yet there was no response or orders, and the firefight raged amongst the convoy as SMARMs and RPG fire rained from above. Meanwhile, Gantamuryov, the former mayor of Grozny, and Dudayev's ally turned enemy, attempted to connect with his men with no success. The firefight was intense, and by 11 in the morning, communications with whole units were completely and utterly lost. Chaos was an understatement, as although the majority of units reached their objectives, many were encircled by numerous groups of Dudayev's forces, the aftermath either being cut down by bullets or captured. The promised units of locals from Grozny in assisting with the operation never occurred, looking like a false promise that was made earlier by Umar Atarukanov. As the leading T-72 tanks with the Russian crews moved forward, they suddenly found that their infantry support had simply disappeared. In the midst of this, they would move from junction to junction, stopping and going as far as asking for directions from Chechen civilians themselves, which was a sight to behold. The tank crews also attempted to radio the superiors, but they were out of range, hence no communication. With the fighting raging now throughout Grozny, what would occur at the presidential palace could only be foreshadowing for what was to come for the Russian forces later on down the line. As 5 tanks reached the presidential palace, an ambush was sprung upon them by Chechen militia commanded by Aslan Maskadov, of which they began to engage the tanks with a classical ambush scheme, firing from the rooftops of nearby tall buildings, along as using the low ground of cellars, making the firing elevation of the tanks completely and utterly obsolete. Maskadov defenses was combined with 3 units numbering between 50 to 100 men, which were composed of the following: the Republic of Chechnya Revolutionary Defense Brigade Shamil Basayev, the Ruslan Gilayev Special Forces Unit, and the Presidential Guard. Also, there were 200 men alongside ad hoc territorial units who were held back in reserve. The ambush worked, resulting in over a dozen tanks and BTRs being knocked out from numerous directions in a matter of minutes. Panic broke among the tank crews, and when opposition infantry forces tried to join in to reinforce them, they found themselves having to retreat from the direction they came, only to be blocked or cut down by small arms fire. As noted by one survivor, the hell that occurred on the grounds of the presidential palace would prove yet again dark foreshadowing of what was held in reserve for the Russian Federation down the line. Then came the tanks, further to a person who is far from both tactics and strategy. It is clear that tanks cannot be driven into the narrow streets of a city. This can only be called idiocy. The tanks claimed their tracks, rolled their barrels around, and sometimes fired, apparently into nowhere. No explosions from shells could be seen through our small window. The tanks were moving in a column of 5 vehicles. Suddenly there was an explosion. Sparks flew like a Bengal fire, and vicious black smoke poured out. A grenade from an RPG-7, fired by one of the Chechen militias, hit the front car exactly where the tower connects to the hull. A hatch opened in the wrecked tank, and a smoking fighter in black overalls literally rolled out. Suddenly, a dark figure, separated from the wall of the house, ran up to the tank man, grabbed him by the collar, and dragged him to the nearest yard. And just in time, ammunition exploded in the burning tank. Its turret was torn off, and spinning a couple times in the air, threw it to the nearest kiosk. The rest of the tanks found themselves in a difficult situation. After standing like a herd of mastodons contemplating the death of their comrade in bewilderment, they moved back in hysterics, in reverse of course, sweeping away cars and telephone booths parked at the side of the road, since the general pictured the battle as follows. Tanks broke into the city, lagging behind the infantry, which in fact should run from behind, hiding behind armor and destroying the enemy grenade launchers. The defenders immediately took advantage of this oversight because it is not difficult to shoot cars with people in narrow streets from the windows of a house. Then began the beating of armored vehicles. In a city without infantry support, tanks are almost as helpless as a lion caught in a trap. Some tankers, without waiting for the terrible outcome, simply left their completely undamaged vehicles and tried to hide. They were caught. Those who resisted were shot on the spot. The rest were taken as hostages to nearby basements. By 2 p.m., based on a message by Umar Atarakanov, the Russian TSS media agency reported Grozny was taken by opposition forces and that Dudayev's government was officially overthrown. Throughout the day, Russian news channels made several reports of the fighting in Grozny. Yet by early afternoon, the Chechens had begun to acquire more prisoners and obtain more information regarding the opposition forces alongside the premise of the whole operation itself. Fighting continued long into the afternoon, with opposition forces finding themselves under constant sniper fire, with Kalamaradatov managing to hold the publishing house until night arrived, of which the difficult decision was made to escape the city by car, of which the remaining BTRs and tanks began to move over from Yavarsky Street toward the Canary plant and then out of the city of Grozny. By 10 p.m., the convoy returned to Tolstoy Yurt. It was over. The operation had ended in complete failure. Casualties ranged between 200 to 500 for opposition forces, alongside over 100 men taken prisoner. As for the Russian servicemen, sources estimate that roughly 70 to 120 were taken prisoner, while an overestimated 70 were KIA, aka killed in action. Out of all the tanks, only 4 managed to escape the city. When the Russian government, alongside the military, attempted to deny their involvement, Dudayev had Russian prisoners paraded for the news media to see around the world. Dudayev also went as far as threatening to execute the Russian POWs if the Russian Federation government did not acknowledge their involvement. Pavel Grachev, the Minister of Defense, would even go as far as publicly denying any participation of Russian servicemen in the fighting, calling them mercenaries. And thus, on November 28th of 1994, the infamous Black Prophecy was told by Grachev himself, as he stated to the Russian public, "If that would be a Russian army, I would never allow to push tanks into the city, as it would be total ignorance. Moreover, with just one paratrooper regiment, we could solve all issues." This would be a quote that would come back to haunt the Russian forces in the weeks that would follow, as on December 1st, Yeltsin acknowledged to assist the Russian prisoners. On the same day, December 1st, 1994, Chechen aviation in Kalanovoska, Kankala, and Grozny Severny Airport were attacked by Russian airstrikes. Airstrikes continued throughout the night, with the air full of illumination munitions deployed by Russian long-range aviation bombers. The same day, the outskirts of Grozny were also attacked in order to destroy Chechen positions, but resulted in merely civilian casualties instead. In total, 198 sorties were conducted, including 71 attack missions by Su-25s and Su-24s, destroying over 177 Chechen aircraft and 4 aviation ammunition depots. The weapons that were used in these raids were as followed: unguided rockets, small caliber bombs ranging from FAB 100s to FAB 250s, and overall with the strict orders to not destroy the runways. Even amidst this airstrike campaign, negotiations continued, and through the following 2 weeks that followed, the POW crisis resulted in 18 Russian crew members being released, while the bodies of 3 Russian tank men were also returned. Others would be released later on. In the coming days, Dudayev would attempt to talk with President Yeltsin to no avail. When Yeltsin was informed by head of President of Security Service, Alexander Korakov, of Dudayev's attempts, Yeltsin's response was merely, "We do not talk to bandits." And so, on December 6, 1994, Pavel Grachayev in the village of Sletsavotskia, on the border between Chechnya and Ingushetia, had a final private conversation with Dudayev. Pavel, Dolzakar, it is your last chance, and let's talk as military professionals. Can we resolve it peacefully with no blood unlike Afghanistan? Do you think you can fight against us? I will break you down in any case. Dudayev, are you seriously meaning the war? Pavel, indeed. The decision has been made, but there is still a chance to back off. Dudayev, I cannot back off. There are many others who will make it happen. Pavel, thus there will be war. Dudayev, let it be war. Pavel, Dozakar, I will smash you like the god would do to a turtle. Dudayev, everything is in Allah's hands. With the conclusion of this meeting, the message was clear. An animosity between two nations on an ethnic and religious level, spanning for more than 3 centuries, would transpire into one of the most bloodiest conflicts in the 21st century. The First Chechen War would finally begin. When I first started this project roughly 2 years ago, I never really expected to get this far, or if I'm going to be brutally honest, finish it. Just the time consuming, and then, how life as a whole just treats you. It was rough, but I'm really happy with the fact that I managed to finally get this out to you guys. And I really look forward to the future, regarding other episodes. But I will brutally admit my original plan was to go and do the first, well, you could honestly say the entirety of the first Chechen War on one video, but that turned out to be quite the overwhelming experience. So, for the most part, this series regarding the First Chechen War will be divided into 3 episodes. So what you guys just heard was episode 1. Episode 2 should be released within a week or two. I'll make sure of doing that, and then followed by the last episode as well. And after that, you, my audience, will basically get to pick, you know, which next conflict I should focus on. And there's plenty of options out there. So don't hesitate to recommend me books, music, etc. Commentate, reach out to me on Instagram or YouTube or whatever. Just go out of your way. But I look forward to entertaining you guys, and not to mention this is my bread and butter overall, military history. I love it. I'm an amateur historian at the present moment, but that will change one day, hopefully in the future. But for the most part, I take a lot of pride that I managed to create something like this for you guys. So I look forward to just your continued support. Our numbers hopefully will grow slowly but steadily, and then eventually I'll manage to get better at this stuff. I'm only in the beginning phase. I learned a couple things here and there, but eventually I know I'll be able to make quality, work even more better than this. But overall, episode 1 for the most part is a really good start. Um, Other than that, I'd like to thank you guys. I'd like to thank my family, my close friends, um, the individuals that I talked about earlier at the beginning of the episode. Um, Honestly, I'm just feel happy. So for the most part, please share, like, subscribe. Do not hesitate to reach out. Overall, I just look forward to giving you guys the best series and just episodes and just content regarding military history, and just getting down to the brutality of it and the realism of it, you know. But overall, thank you yet again. Again, my name's Diego. I just look forward to, just continuing to do this. Overall, have a good time, have a wonderful next year, whatever, and God be with you, and God bless, and overall, I know it sounds kind of corny, but Christ is King because I don't know how the hell I would have gotten here this far. But overall, have a wonderful time and catch you guys on the second episode of Hardcore Combat History. Next time on Hardcore Combat History, war has been declared and the Russian Federation moves forward with what they perceive is to be a less than 2-week operation. What they'll find is not a force that retreats, but one that fights. Overall, the horrors and the journey for just to reach the capital Grozny can be caught on the second episode of Hardcore Combat History, Highway to Hell, Grozny, 94.